Have you ever found yourself wondering what Melbourne looked like in the 1850s and 60s? When the city was just a wild frontier, its streets teeming with gold diggers, horse-drawn carriages, and a promise of fortune? On August 19, 1916, the Australasian published from Melbourne carried the childhood memories of a grandmother, titled Melbourne in the 1850s and 1860s, Reminiscences of a Grandmother. This memoir takes us beyond the history books, into the heart and soul of a city being born from dust and dreams. Join us, in this tale of the past, to walk the streets of Melbourne as they once were, to witness the humble beginnings of the metropolis. The grandma speaks about various things she witnessed in Melbourne as a child in the 1850s and 60s. So let us begin the journey.
Coming from a bush home, we children found life in Melbourne wonderful. I can remember seeing the Union Jack floating from the Flagstaff on the hill, which, in those days, was a kind of rendezvous where people met to converse on local topics. Melbourne was quite a small place in 1852. It was hot and dusty, and everyday drays with teams of patient bullocks could be seen heavily laden with stores for the diggings, travelling through the dust towards Elizabeth Street. The bullock drivers carried formidable whips, which they lashed at the teams, sometimes most cruelly. Diggers with long beards and red or blue shirts, top boots, and cabbage tree hats thronged the streets, and very few of them took care of their money. They spent most of it in hotels and threw it recklessly about. It was quite a common thing to find shillings and sixpences on the dusty road, and there was a story told of a digger who lit his pipe with a pound note. They generally had long hair, as well as beards, and used plenty of hair oil. Their full dress costume, as a rule, was a dress coat and figured satin waistcoat, and most of them were fond of jewelry, wearing jeweled breast pins, massive rings, and watch chains. Once, we saw a digger's wedding from our dining room window, and in the carriage in which he and his bride rode was a case of champagne and several tin pannikins. Seeing someone employed on a building, the bridegroom called all of them to drink to his and his bride's health, which they did with enthusiasm, singing, "For he's a jolly good fellow." The bride, who was very grandly dressed in pink silk, with a bonnet adorned with waving feathers, smiled and nodded good-naturedly. At the west end of the town stood Batman's Hill, adorned with she-oak trees, and on fete days, the bands of the 44th and 99th regiments played there. All the children of that time looked forward to hearing the band as quite an event and liked seeing the soldiers march through the town, but their uniforms would look odd now. Imagine a kind of blue undress with a crimson sash, heavy gold scales on their shoulders, and forage caps with Roman numerals and perpendicular peaks. Little girls in 1852 wore cottage bonnets tied under the chin, with either flowers or a small ruche inside the rim. Their frocks were long, and they also wore white socks and black strapped shoes, with small silk capes on their shoulders. Most families employed a governess to teach their children and sent them to a dancing academy as well, to learn the fashionable new dance, the polka. Mr. Braid's Dancing Academy was a long building of corrugated iron and stood somewhere behind the spot where Scott's Church now stands. The future judges, barristers, doctors, members of Parliament, and all the little girls of the period learned the 1-2-3 hops of the polka, which was the new Polish dance and all the rage. The dressing room at Mr. Braid's was small and stuffy, redolent of pomade and macassar oil, as everyone used those cosmetics at the time. However, in a hot and dusty town like Melbourne, it was not a clean habit, and men who wore their hair long, as was the fashion, generally had very dusty, greasy coat collars. Their satin waistcoats, which were often embroidered with coloured silks, sometimes featured designs of birds and flowers. Bullock drays and spring carts were often seen in Collins Street, along with cows and travelling sheep, as there was no way of laying the dust except by water carts. These carts were filled at the Yarra and watered the streets in some parts, but the dust in the suburbs was terrible. When crossing the road, you were generally ankle-deep in it, so children had to change their white socks every day. Little girls usually had to walk out with a nurse or governess. They were told to remain silent while out, so they walked through the streets very demurely, not even venturing to gaze into shop windows. St. James English Church was a relatively new building, with galleries and tall, high pews, and a device on the steeple resembling a pair of spectacles, with stony eyes gazing over the town. In one gallery sat Mr. La Trobe, the governor, and his family. The officers of the 40th Regiment occupied another, and in a high pew near the pulpit sat two Quaker ladies in plain grey dresses and cottage bonnets. Close by sat the Dean's family, the mother with gentle eyes and rippling hair, along with several pretty daughters and handsome sons. Dean Macartney always looked as if he belonged to the 18th century, with his knee breeches, silk stockings, and buckled shoes. He was a fine preacher and a truly pious man, though, in some ways, his views might now be considered narrow. When the troops were sent to Ballarat to assist in quelling the riots during the Eureka Stockade, the body of a little drummer boy who had been shot was sent down to the military barracks, which were close to our house. It was then, for the first time, that we saw a military funeral. It was the most impressive sight, and several guns were fired over his grave. St. Francis Roman Catholic Church was also quite a new building at that time. The rector, Dr. G. O'Hagan, a good and conscientious man, later went to Adelaide and became the bishop of the Roman Catholic Church there, where he eventually died. The construction of St. Francis Church is said to have been due to his influence with the Catholic people, by whom he was greatly beloved. After the discovery of gold, food rose to famine prices. Bread, at one time, was $1 a loaf. Butter and milk were also very expensive, so American tinned fruit, jams, and crackers were largely used. Cakes of cranberries were also sold, along with all sorts of other berries, which the children of the day fully appreciated, as so little fresh fruit was available. A number of Chinese began to make their appearance in Melbourne. They all wore suits of buff-coloured or blue nankeen and funny-looking fat hats, and their hair was plaited into pigtails. Each man's pigtail reached far below his waist, and they walked one after the other in a line, never side by side. Many of them settled in Canvas Town, which stood somewhere near the spot where the military barracks are now. It was a strange, dusty-looking assortment of canvas tents, which also served as shops, forming a long street of tents in front of which all manner of goods were exposed for sale, with all the eatables swarming with flies. The old wooden post office was a shabby building, even in its best days, and from the veranda, one could see the heavily laden bullock wagons passing, as Elizabeth Street was the thoroughfare through which they passed en route to the diggings. There was a road beside the Yarra River along which people walked from Melbourne to the Botanic Gardens, then in their infancy. Dr. Muller and his sister lived in the little red cottage at the entrance of the gardens. The doctor was a very learned botanist and also served as the curator of the gardens. He was a German of the old simple type, before the nation had been Prussianized and brutalized, and a kind, genial man devoted to his sister. Miss Muller and the doctor feasted their little friends on German cakes and gave them rides on his pony. The old Olympic Theatre stood, I think, in Queen Street, though I am not sure about that point, and it was there that Lola Montez, the celebrated adventuress, danced. However, people only mentioned her with bated breath in front of children. Crochet was the fashionable work of the period, and being able to crochet large and unsightly antimacassars was the ambition of most children, who regarded them as works of art. Smoking caps, bonnets, and even nightcaps were made from crochet work, not to mention handbags and silk purses. The songs street Arabs sang were Cheer Boys Cheer, The Irish Immigrant, and Alice Ben Bolt, and they persistently whistled Yankee Doodle, and The Pope Goes the Weasel in the streets. The cemetery in Melbourne, now known as the Old Cemetery, was a pretty place where tall gum trees and golden wattle waved over the grass-covered graves, and here and there, a tombstone or a family vault could be seen. It seemed, indeed, like God's acre to the children who dwelt in the hot and dusty town, with only a strip of garden before their homes. Here, many of the pioneers and their children slept their last long sleep, while living children played close by. Mr. and Mrs. La Trobe lived out close to what was then known as Government Paddock, an enclosed portion of the Primeval Forest. Government House was merely a large wooden villa, with a wide veranda surrounded by a well-kept garden, at one end of which was a grotto built for La Trobe's only son, Charlie. It was roomy enough inside for several children to stand in, and the whole garden was delightful, with its shady trees and garden seats. Before the old government house was pulled down, 2 shelves specially designed by Mrs. La Trobe to hold eggs could still be seen in the pantry. Holes were made in rows above the shelves so that each egg could be placed upright when taken from the nest and not shaken at all. By this means, eggs were set to retain their freshness for some time. It was a Swiss method, as Mrs. La Trobe was a native of Switzerland and a notable housekeeper, as well as an accomplished musician and a charming woman. Children's parties were often held in their early days, and as it was fashionable for everyone to wear their hair in curls, many of them went to the hairdresser, especially if they aspired to 3 rows of curls. Most children wore only 1 or 2 rows of curls, one above the other, but 3 rows were considered extremely fashionable. At these dances, a pretty little face was often seen peeping out from a multitude of curls, making the head look far too big for the childish neck and shoulders, but the little ones were happy. At the time of the rush to the diggings, builders always found it almost impossible to get skilled workmen, so weatherboard houses were hastily constructed and tiled with square tin tiles of the same thickness as kerosene tins. In North Melbourne, a family lived in a 2-storied house of this kind, and on windy days, the tin tiles flew off in all directions. As the kitchen had been only roofed with sheets of felt, a sturdy Irish immigrant clambered onto the roof with a hammer and nails. However, when she saw part of her kitchen roof wavering, she set to work anathematizing Australia and everything connected with it in broad Irish. The Fitzroy Gardens in the year 1853 were unknown. They now occupy land that was merely a square bushland covered with tall eucalypti and golden with wattle bloom in the spring. In those days, it was called Fitzroy Square. A 3-railed rough fence separated it from the road, and the spot where the beautiful Fern Gully now spans a rustic bridge was, in the old days, used as a rubbish tip and was full of broken bottles, straw, and rubbish. For many years, the only bridge across this place consisted of 2 boards placed together and fastened down at each end. 2 people could not possibly have passed each other on these boards, so the wags made merry at the expense of stout wayfarers on this slender bridge, caricaturing them again and again. The trees were full of opossums, and the wattles were laden with knobs of amber-tinted gums, which all the merry little gum suckers of that time fully appreciated. After school hours, little fingers pressed the yielding bark, and when the gums oozed out sweet and delicious, they lingered with their companions, returning home with very sticky fingers and large bundles of golden wattle. The government paddock in 1853 was a lovely piece of bushland. The grass in places was knee-deep, and the wildflowers were very beautiful. Long trails of snowy clematis hung from shrub-like trees, and ancient eucalyptus trees of immense girth stood there, as they had stood perhaps for hundreds of years. Here, the golden wattle grew in abundance, especially on what was known as Friendly Society's gardens. What nosegays of wildflowers the children gathered in the old government paddock. Chocolate flowers and purple blooms with fringed edges, smelling strongly of chocolate, bachelor's buttons, blue pin cushions, ladies' slipper orchids, also hooded ladies, jack-in-the-pulpits, white and pink heath, and long trailing sprays of scarlet creeper, sweet-scented honeyflowers, wild violets, primroses, and miniature pansies, along with the tiny black and white-scented lilies. The snowdrop and flycatcher grew there. Some parts of the government paddock, being thickly timbered and full of scrub, were considered unsafe after dark, as they were said to be the resort of pickpockets and garrotters. One man was said to have been murdered there. The paddock was used by the police for their horses, and there was a cleared space where the present cricket ground, MCG, now stands, where the old colonists assembled to play cricket. At the lower end of the paddock, close to the fence, there used to be a very pretty shallow lagoon, on which snowy white water lilies floated, and around the edges of which grew all kinds of tiny coloured flowers. Not a vestige of the lagoon is to be seen today. The Yarra, which means flowing, was so clear that you could see the pebbles in the shallow part of it, but snags were plentiful, and every boating party carried a boat hook on that account. All along the right-hand bank of the Yarra were vineyards, and picnic parties generally bought grapes and melons there on their way to Studley Park or to the Surveyor's Paddock, a favourite place for picnics. The old-time boating parties were very joyous. They sang with a will the beautiful song of the Canadian boatman, "Row, brothers, row, the steam runs faster," and when they reached the willows at Victoria Bridge, they rested a while in their shade. Those immense willow trees are said to have been planted by an old colonist, Mr. Balcombe, who brought the cuttings from Napoleon's grave at Longwood, St. Helena. The Bishop's Palace, as Bishop Perry's house was called, was considered a very grand building indeed in the 50s. At the time, Reverend Dr. Cairns preached in an old-fashioned wooden church on Eastern Hill, and the old bluestone manse is still standing, though the wooden church and the bluestone one that succeeded it have long vanished. The Red Jacket and the Marco Polo were considered the fastest sailing ships between England and Australia, and music was composed and called after them. When the sad news came to Melbourne of the death of Burke and Wills, all Australians deeply lamented their untimely deaths, and hundreds of people saw their coffins lying in state at the Royal Society's building. Later on, their funerals were witnessed by a great crowd of people, some even standing on the roof of Parliament House to see the procession pass.